All right. So, um, good evening, everybody. So this is the last class of this academic year, I guess you want to call it. And so the topic that I want to look at is first of all the question of defining the word Zionism, and then exploring the question of if anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. Okay, so I want to start with a story that happened to me in my first year working as a rabbi, so like 33 years ago, when I was the Hillel director at the University of Judaism. And a student who was active in Hillel came in very upset. He's taking a class in Middle Eastern history, and in the textbook, it says that when Zionism started, it was perceived as a rebellion against the Jewish religion. And obviously, this is wrong and terrible and anti-Semitic. And it is my job as the rabbi of the UVA community to talk to the professor and set them straight and have them stop using this anti-Semitic textbook. And I said to him, Bobby, there's a problem here, okay? Because that textbook is actually right. And this is something, you know, and let me say from the outset that I consider myself a Zionist.
Futures.
Okay, but I don't think that being a Zionist means that you have to ignore history. Okay, and the fact of the matter is that when Zionism first started, it was opposed by almost all rabbis, whether Orthodox or Reform. And I say Orthodox or Reform because the denominational breakdown in Europe was not quite the same as it is here. And in Germany, for example, Reform and conservative were kind of in the same boat. Whereas in this community, conservative and Orthodox were kind of in the same boat. But at any rate, both Orthodox and Reform rabbis, by and large, opposed Zionism. Okay, the Orthodox viewed it as rebellion against God. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Okay, when I'm discussing this with teenagers, I ask them the following question, right? Suppose you did something bad and your parents grounded you, right? Your parents grounded you, okay? And who decides when the grounding is done, right? It's not you, it's your parents, right? And the traditional view is that exile is a punishment from God, that God sent us into exile. Okay, and if God is the one who sent us into exile, then God is the one who decides when the exile ends. Okay, now it doesn't mean that we like exile, it doesn't mean that we're comfortable with it, and it is absolutely the case, you know, which I'll get to later, that there are prayers for return to Zion in the Siddur, right? V'techazena einenu b'shuvacha l'tzion b'rachamim. May our eyes behold your return to Zion in mercy. V'tolichenu kumimiut liartzenu. Bring us walking upright to our land, etc. I mean, you can find, you know, a lot of them, but it's always a plea for God to do it, right? And at a certain point, some Jews basically said, we are tired of waiting for God to act, so we're going to do it on our own, okay? And that they were, for the most part, secular, okay? I mean, there's also this myth, right? This myth that until 2 generations ago, everybody was frum, right? I mean, the number of people who told me how Orthodox their grandparents were, right? And how religious they were and how strict. I'm not interested in how observant your grandparents were. I'm interested in how observant you are, okay? Because Judaism doesn't live on the memory of observant grandparents, right? But the fact of the matter is that it's not the case that everybody was super frum until 2 generations ago. I mean, if you look at just Fiddler on the Roof, right, you see how the different choices that Jews actually faced in the Tsarist Empire, right? Assimilation, conversion, Zionism, socialism, religion, right? There were different choices that people would make. Okay, so it was viewed as chutzpah klapei shamayim, right? Chutzpah vis-a-vis God, whereas the Reform viewed Zionism as challenging their status, the status of Jews as loyal citizens, right? In other words, if you look at, for example, the Pittsburgh Platform, which was the first platform of Reform Judaism in this country, we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community. And we are loyal citizens of the countries in which we reside. Okay, and I'll add something else, because one thing that drives me right up the wall is when people refer to synagogues as temples. Okay, I mean, we are not a temple, we are a synagogue. Okay, and the fact of the matter is that the word temple was chosen explicitly as a statement against Zionism, right? Because there's only one temple and it's in Jerusalem. And by calling your synagogue a temple, you're saying we don't need that anymore. This is our temple, this is our holy land. Okay, and I absolutely understand that when people say temple today, they don't mean it as an anti-Zionist statement. I'm not saying that but that is the history of calling synagogues temples. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, Jewish liturgy is certainly replete with prayers for return to Zion, but they call on God to restore us. References to Israel in the liturgy are not references to the state of Israel or even the land of Israel, right? Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, right? May the one who makes peace in the heavens make peace for us and all Israel. Doesn't mean the state of Israel, and it doesn't mean the land of Israel. It means the people of Israel, right? Am Yisrael, not Medinat Yisrael or Eretz Yisrael, right? And the word, parenthetically, the word Jew barely appears in the Bible at all, right? It appears a few times in Daniel, and it appears in the book of Esther, and I think pretty much that's it. Okay, and another thing that drives me right up the wall, although I've learned to live with it because people don't like it when you're too pedantic, is if somebody makes the statement, when Moses led the Jews out of Egypt. Okay, Moses did not lead the Jews out of Egypt, right? Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. The word Jew was not in use. We did not become Jews until the Second Temple period. Before that, we were Ivriim, Hebrews, and then B'nai Yisrael, right? Which is more properly translated as Israelites, not the children of Israel. Because B'nai, in this sense, means somebody who belongs to a group. Okay, but so certainly, but Yisrael in the liturgy refers to what we would call the Jewish people, right? I mean, yeah, today in modern Hebrew, you might say Ha'am HaYehudi, but in classical Hebrew, you would never say Ha'am HaYehudi. You would say Am Yisrael, which doesn't mean people who live in a certain geographic area. It means the Jews. Okay. So, and I covered some of this history earlier in the class, right? That most American Jews were non or anti-Zionist until the rise of Hitler. Okay, I mean, that is not to say that there were not Zionists in America, because there were. I mean, Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court justice, was a Zionist. He was simultaneously a justice on the Supreme Court and the president of the Zionist Organization of America. Henrietta Zold, who founded Hadassah, and later went to live in Israel. I did my master's thesis on the history of the North American branch of Hashomer Tzair, which is a socialist Zionist youth movement, right? And so certainly there were Zionists in the United States, but they were the minority up until the rise of Hitler, when Jews embraced Zionism, not necessarily for ideological reasons so much as pragmatic reasons, right? I mean, and we saw this. I mean, we know that at the beginning, Hitler was absolutely happy to let the Jews go, right? But very few places would take them, right? I mean, there was the Kindertransport to Germany. Handfuls of Jews were let in here. Handfuls of Jews were let in other countries, but for the most part, the democracies of the West would not take them. And people would say, look, if there was a piece of land that we as a people controlled, nobody could lock the gates, right? Because the British White Paper essentially locked the gates of what was then known as Palestine. I mean, again, handfuls of people were let in, but for the most part, even when Jews could flee, there was nowhere for them to go. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about something that Amos Oz, I heard him say, and let me tell you. I mean, to any Israeli, I think Amos Oz is a familiar name. Perhaps became more familiar in this country a few years ago when Natalie Portman made a film of Amos Oz's novel, A Tale of Love and Darkness. She directed it, she starred in it. The film is in Hebrew. She was born in Israel, and she speaks a fairly passable Hebrew, although I think she worked on it for this film. But Amos Oz is I would say one of Israel's three greatest novelists, I would say. I mean, I think three greatest novelists are Amos Oz and Aleph Bet Yoshua and David Grossman. But all three of them also write about political stuff. And Oz, and I heard him say this, that Zionism is a last name and that it has many first names, right? In other words, to say the word Zionist is incomplete in a way, right? There are other adjectives that define the word Zionism: labor Zionism, religious Zionism, revisionist Zionism, which is the Zionism first of Jabotinsky and then Begin and Netanyahu. I mean, he grew up in the revisionist movement, general Zionism, cultural Zionism, right? And the goal of Zionism was to create a Jewish homeland in Eretz Yisrael, but not necessarily a state per se. Okay, although I think, to be intellectually honest, most Zionists, their goal from the beginning was to create a state. I mean, certainly even the Balfour Declaration didn't promise a state; it promised a homeland, right? But there were Jews, up until the very creation of the state of Israel, who supported not a Jewish state, but a binational state. Okay, I mentioned Hashomer Tzair, the Hashomer Tzair movement, which started the Kibbutz Artzi and the Mapam Party, and an important element within Zionism as a whole was for a binational state. The philosopher Martin Buber supported a binational state. Judah Magnus, who was the first president of the Hebrew University, or the first chancellor, I guess, of the Hebrew University, supported a binational state, that they felt that that justice could not be done having a Jewish state given the presence of so many Arabs in the country, and that therefore the goal should be a binational state. Okay, and the reason that I say this is because I think it's important to understand that if I say, because there's so much argument and misunderstanding about the term Zionism, right? But to say I am a Zionist does not tell you anything about a person's support for any particular government, support for settlements, support for annexation, support for the nation state law, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I remember, a few elections ago, the Labor Party and Tzipi Livni's party, and Tzipi Livni was a sort of, she left the Likud to start a more moderate group, and they called their group the Zionist Union. Okay, the Labor Party and Tzipi Livni's Hatnuah called themselves the Zionist Union. Why? Because their argument was that by the creeping annexation of the territories, that actually the Likud was leading Israel towards a de facto binational state, and that if you wanted a Jewish state, you had to actually divest yourselves as much as possible of the territories. So that calling yourself a Zionist doesn't mean you support annexation or the occupation or anything like that. It's like I said, as Oz says, that it's a last name and that there are many first names. Okay, so I want to, and he wrote this in the late 80s. Okay, but I will say that Amos Oz's Zionist credo is my credo as well. Okay, which doesn't mean you have to agree with it. I'm just, we put all our cards on the table here. Okay, so here's what Amos is: a tool, an instrument that is necessary for a return to Zion, but I am not enamored of this instrument. I would be more than happy to live in a world composed of dozens of civilizations, each developing in accordance with its own internal rhythm, all cross-pollinating one another, without any one emerging as a nation state. No flag, no emblem, no passport, no anthem, no nothing. Only spiritual civilizations tied somehow to their lands, without the tools of statehood and without the instruments of war. But the Jewish people has already staged a long-running one-man show of that sort. The international audience sometimes applauded the actor. No one joined us. No one copied the model the Jews were forced to sustain for 2,000 years, the model of a civilization without the tools of statehood. For me, this drama ended with the murder of Europe's Jews by Hitler. Okay, so, and I remember Oz writing one time, once, when his father was a child in Germany, they would write graffiti on the walls, Jews go to Palestine, right? And now they write graffiti on the walls, Jews get out of Palestine, right? So where are we supposed to go, right? And that I think is what Oz is saying, is that the state is an instrument, okay? And the more I think about it, I mean, when I went through that list of different types of Zionism and I put religious Zionism, I think I would say I'm religious and I'm a Zionist, but I don't know that I'm a religious Zionist, okay? Because the question is, does the state per se have religious value. Okay, and this is an internal Israeli debate. I mean, and it is one of the debates between, between Dati Leumi and Haredi and all sorts of gradations in between, right? Whether the state per se has religious value. But to me, the state has instrumental value. Okay, I mean, it's important to me, but it's primarily important to me as a framework, in which to struggle over what it means to be a Jewish state, and more importantly, as a framework that provides, we say, Ufros aleinu sukkot shlomecha, right? Spread over us the sukkah of your peace, right? Well, the sukkah of peace is the Iron Dome, really. I mean, and that I firmly believe that there has to be a piece of land on this earth that the Jews control. And if you have to flee, they have to let you in. And I think we've learned the danger of when you, and so from my perspective, obviously I'm not an Israeli, but I would be happy for Israel to be the 15th or 20th or 30th country in the world to give up its sovereignty. Not Israel to be the first country to do it. Okay, I mean, I think Amos is spot on in what he said. Okay, I'm gonna stop here for a moment, see if there's any comments or questions or discussions on anything that I've said so far, because I feel like I'm talking a lot. All right, so we'll go on. I'm going to try something I've never done it before, and that is sharing a YouTube video on Zoom. But I'm going to do that, and actually, this fortuitous is very interesting. I don't know if the name Daniel Gordis means anything. I mean, he's a pretty well-known author at this point. Danny and I worked together in LA. And so, I consider him a friend, although I certainly agree with everything that. And he sent out this morning a link to a video clip that I want to share with you. Okay, I mean, it's of a talk by David Grossman. I mentioned David Grossman before. He's one of the most important contemporary Israeli novelists. He's younger than Oz and Yehoshua. He's older than me. He was born in 54 or 56. And also, like Israeli novelists, I first heard about him or him when not a book about the situation, which was translated into English as Yellow Wind, which was a book about the situation in the West Bank in the late 80s. And Grossman is very involved in, what he calls the left, meaning Peace Now and peace movements in Israel. And in 2006, his son Uri was killed on the last day of the Lebanon. Okay, and interestingly enough, a ceasefire was already signed but hadn't gone into effect yet when his son was killed. Okay, so he gave this talk at Shalem College in Jerusalem, and one of the students asked him, and they said, it's a terrible thing to even ask the question, but do you ever say to yourself, if I hadn't chosen to stay in Israel, my son would still be alive? Okay, and this is his answer. If I manage to successfully share. Okay, here we go.
שאלנו את עצמנו, האם להישאר פה? כי כל השאלות נשאלו. האם להיות, איך אפשר להמשיך ולהיות אחרי דבר כזה? ואני חושב שמי שלא שואל את עצמו את השאלה הזאת, ולו רק למען השאלה, למען גמישות המחשבה, ולא משנה כמה הוא דבק בחיים, אבל לשאול את השאלה הזאת צריך, כדי אחר כך לדבוק בחיים באופן אחר, בחיים כאן, באופן אחר. אני חי פה כי בשבילי זה המקום שבו יש לחיים שלי משמעות שאני רוצה לדבוק בה. המקום הזה רלוונטי לי באופן ששום מקום אחר לא רלוונטי. אני יכול לנסוע למקומות יפים, אני יכול ללמד בכל מיני אוניברסיטאות בעולם, אבל הכאב שלהם הוא לא הכאב שלי, וגם השמחה בסופו של דבר היא קצת אחרת. בעוד שכאן גם הדברים שמוציאים אותי מדעתי הם רלוונטיים לי, אני מבין לפחות עד עתה, לא יודע כמה זמן זה יימשך, אני מבין את הקודים שיוצרים כל מיני התנהגויות שמוציאות אותי מדעתי, או מוציאות אותי מדעתי. ולא הייתי רוצה לחיות במקום אחר, כי אני רוצה לחיות במקום רלוונטי, כי החיים קצרים מכדי לחיות אותם במקום לא רלוונטי, במקום לא פחות רלוונטי. בשבילי זה המקום. אני רוצה שפה יהיה העתיד של ילדיי, של נכדותיי, ואני רוצה שהמקום הזה יהיה בית. זה הדלק של כל הפעילות שלי הפוליטית במשך הרבה מאוד שנים. אני חושב שההגדרה של אדם יהודי ושל הקולקטיב היהודי לאורך השנים היו של מי שמעולם לא חשו בבית בעולם. אפילו במקומות הידידותיים, תמיד ריחף איזה צל, ריחף איזה ספק. תמיד זה היה כאילו יש את הנקודות המצוירות מסביב התלישה, ואפשרות התלישה המהירה, ואפשרות הגירוש המהיר, או ההשמדה. וישראל נועדה להיות הבית, נועדה להיות המקום שבו אתה בטוח, שבו הסדרת את יחסיך עם שכניך, שבו אין שום מחלוקת לגבי אף אחד מהחדרים של הבית שלך. וקשה וכואב לי שעדיין, גם אחרי 72, כמעט 73, לא הגענו לשלב שבו אנחנו מרגישים ממש את הנינוחות של אדם בתוך ביתו. ומדברים הרבה על המחירים של המצב ושל האלימות ושל הכיבוש. כל אלה דברים ידועים, אבל יש דבר שלא זכינו לו, והלוואי נזכה לו אי פעם, אתם רובכם עוד אנשים צעירים ויש לכם סיכוי. להיות בבית, להרגיש את הנוחות, את מידת הביטחון הפנימי, את השלווה, את הידיעה שתראה בנים לבניך, והם יראו בנים ובני בנים. זו הרגשה שאנחנו לא מכירים, פשוט לא מכירים. אין לנו, בגלל היעדרה, אין לנו את תחושת המוצקות של הקיום שיש בכל כך הרבה מדינות אחרות. אצלנו האדמה רועדת מתחת לרגלינו, והחרדות שלנו מכתיבות את חיינו, ואני לא מזלזל בחרדות האלה. אני בקשר חזק מאוד בתוכי עם החרדות האלה, ואני לא שייך לשמאלנים שבזים לחרדות של הימין. לא, ממש לא. אני חושב שהחרדות האלה מבטאות מציאות נכונה, אי אפשר להתכחש לזה. אבל המציאות לא מורכבת אך ורק מחרדות. ולפעמים דברים שאנחנו נעשה והאופן שבו אנחנו ננהג כלפי החרדות האלה, יכול להיות שהם ישנו גם את אופיין של הסכנות מבחוץ. יכול להיות. לא יכול להגיד לכם שאני בטוח. אני בטוח רק בדבר אחד, שאם לא נעשה מהר משהו כדי לשנות את מצבנו, מצבנו יהיה רמת. ובתור מי שאכפת לו מהמקום הזה, ומי שרוצה שהמקום הזה יהיה בית, אני לא יכול להרשות לעצמי את הלוקסוס שבייאוש מהשינוי.
That was, I have to say, that was pretty impressive. I mean, it's a shame that most of you don't understand Hebrew well enough, because his Hebrew, I mean, the translation was a good translation, but his Hebrew is so... Uh-oh. I didn't close my YouTube window. I'm sorry. Went to the next video. Just really beautiful. But I think, I mean, I can see the connection, I think, between what Amos Oz said back in the 80s and what David Grossman said. This was from 2019. This idea of feeling at home, right? And that Grossman said that Jewish existence has been marked by precisely that lack of being able to feel at home, and that's what Israel was intended to offer to Jews, and in fact, that has not materialized, right? And his and this is something that I think people don't often understand. I mean, look, I will tell you, certainly, in a small group like this, right? I have no use for Netanyahu. I mean, I think he's done some good things, but I think he's done a lot of damage to the country. And I'm much more optimistic about the new government. Although, given the contradictions within the new government, I don't know. But the thing is, it's because I love Israel. And I really think that the ongoing failure to resolve the situation is leading Israel towards a one-state solution. Okay, and what's interesting is that the right and the left both want a one-state solution. Right? They both want a one-state solution. The difference is that the Israeli right says a one state, but not only Jews will be citizens, because the Jews, the Arabs who live within the 1967 borders, who have always been citizens, they will be citizens and vote. But the overwhelming majority of Arabs, those who live in the West Bank, will not be citizens and will not vote, right? And that is a situation that is certainly immoral and certainly threatens the support of Israel by the world Jewish community and by the democracies of the world. I think it's in the long run untenable. And when Grossman says if we don't change to something really quick, our fate is dire, this is what he's talking about. Okay, and on the other hand, the left also wants a one-state solution, but a binational state, right? Jews and Arabs will have the same vote and the same rights, and if by a democratic majority, they want to change the flag and change the name of the country and get rid of Hatikva and to be a truly real binational state, that's fine, because that's democracy. Okay, and repeal the law of return, because that's democracy, right? And I think that's also a very bad solution. I don't think it's immoral necessarily, but I think it's impractical, and it may be a goal down the line, but you're not going to go there. You're not going to go there overnight. Okay, so in the wake of the Philadelphia incident, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who's the executive director of TRUA, which is a rabbinic human rights group, of which I am not a member. I support some of what they do and some of what they stand for. I disagree with some of what they do and some of what they stand for. And I'm not a member of that group, but she put out like a series of about 20 tweets on this question, and I'll try and not summarize and do a little bit paraphrase what she said, because I think it's important, because she is speaking, from a position on the left to people on the left. And she says that we have to recognize that there is a difference between Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, right? I mean, and they're not the same thing. For example, I mean, Hebron, which is certainly part of the land of Israel, but it's not part of the internationally recognized borders of the state of Israel. Whereas a place like Eilat is not part of Eretz Yisrael. It's not part of the biblical land of Israel, but it's certainly part of the state of Israel. Okay. She says that to deny the existence of the Jewish people and or their connection to Eretz Yisrael is anti-Semitic. Okay, the Jews exist as a people, and we are connected to Eretz Yisrael. And if you deny that, as some Palestinians have, for example, there was never a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount, and so on and so forth. Those kind of things are anti-Semitic, but it's very legitimate to have differences of opinion regarding the actions of Medinat Yisrael, the settlements, a one-state versus a two-state solution. All of these are legitimate, but they have to take into account the existence of several million Israeli Jews who have no other citizenship, right? In other words, sometimes when you talk to people who say Israel has no right to exist, okay, well, what about all the Jews? They should just go back where they came from, right? Well, I mean, it's 73 years after the establishment of the state of Israel, right? I mean, most Israeli Jews have no other citizenship. There's no where they came from for them to go back to, right? And so, what is supposed to happen to these several million Israeli Jews who have no other citizenship? All right, so that she would say that anti-Zionism is not automatically anti-Semitism, but it often is. And I think that is correct. I mean, I think you could, it depends also what you define as being anti-Zionist. I mean, I'm sure that there are certainly people well to my right who say, well, if you support a two-state solution, you're not a Zionist, right? Which means Yitzhak Rabin wasn't a Zionist and Arik Sharon wasn't a Zionist, right? But, I mean, everybody gets to define, terms for themselves, right? So, the incident that took place in Philadelphia with the Israeli food truck, okay, and it was like served up to me on a silver platter because I'd already announced, the topic of this talk, but there was this incident in Philadelphia. There's apparently it's been going on for every month since like May. So this month would have been the second. a food truck festival called Eat Up the Borders, or it's called A Taste of Home. The organization that runs it is called Eat Up the Borders. And it's a celebration of the contributions of immigrants to the cultural life of the country. Okay, and so they invited this food truck called Moshava, which is owned by an Israeli immigrant and does what they call Israeli street food. And apparently at the previous one, they said, and I'm not necessarily sure I see anything wrong with this, that if we're going to have an Israeli food truck, we also want to have a Palestinian food truck, okay, to sort of balance things out and not be seen as, supporting one side or the other. But it's not clear exactly all of the details, but the Palestinian food truck said, we have a conflict, we can't make it this time. And then they heard that there were going to be protests against the Israeli food truck, and they were afraid that they might turn violent. And so they disinvited the Israeli food truck. Okay. And then as a result of that, the backlash against that decision was so intense that they canceled the whole thing, right? They canceled the whole thing. And subsequent to that, they put out a statement which said, essentially, we screwed up. We're sorry. We didn't think it through. And I think that that's right. I mean, I think that what happened is they just sort of panicked. Right? They're not in the politics business, they're in the food truck festival business, and they kind of panicked and handled it incompetently more than anything else. And the food truck put out a statement, and I think they're right, that the organizers of the festival were not coming from a place of anti-Semitism, but that many of the people who said that they would protest against the Israeli food truck were coming from a place of anti-Semitism, right? Because look, for many Americans, Israeli culture is part of our Jewish identity, right? It's certainly not like the whole of our Jewish identity, but it is a part of it. Moreover, I think it's one thing to protest the Israeli government, and it's another thing to protest an Israeli immigrant who sells Israeli street food, right? Just like, if Palestinians or pro-Palestinians or whoever want to have a demonstration against Israel in front of the Israeli embassy, fair game, right? To have a demonstration against Israel in front of our shul, right? That I think is anti-Semitism, right? And so, the food truck thing, I think, was kind of a microcosm of this whole question. And I mean, I think it reflects a lot of things that are going on in our society, so-called cancel culture and whatever, but where we have not learned, I think, to talk about our disagreements in a peaceable manner. So so that's kind of what I wanted to say. And again, I mean, this is not intended to be a monologue. So if there are questions, comments, or just reactions to what I've put out there, I'm really interested in hearing it. Al, if you're saying something, Alan, you're muted. Anyone? Marcia, please. Thank you.
Okay, I just unmuted. Just disturbed about the found what, everything pretty much what you said was interesting. And my own feelings on reading some of this is it's just frustrating that somehow we just can't get past these differences. And where does the state of Israel exists? I'm not getting my thoughts very clearly, but it's just, I know I get disturbed by some of the things it does that shows some of the prejudices and difficulties. And then the reactions here where everything comes down to, turns to the Jewish community or to individual Jews. It seems like it's never ending.
Right. No, look, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that there is a difference in sort of, debating kind of like what ifs, right? I mean, if you want to maintain that it was a mistake in 1948 to create the state of Israel, fine, right? If you want to maintain that, things would have been better had they listened to Buber and Magnus and Hashomer Tzair, whatever. I mean, that's an interesting historical debate, but it is 73 years later, right? There is a state, right? Even if you may, and by the way, this goes in both directions, right? I mean, if you maintain that the Israeli people is a modern construct, yeah, it is a modern construct. Many Israelis maintain that the Palestinian people is a modern construct. It is also a modern construct, right? I mean, if you look at, the history, I mean, there was no entity of Palestinians. They were Arabs or they were Hebronites or whatever, Muslims, Bethlehemites, but the identity of a Palestinian people per se, that's a reaction to Zionism. There's no question. But the Palestinian people exists as a distinct people today, just like the state of Israel exists as a state today, and the Israeli people exist as a people today. I mean, if you don't believe that, just go to certain areas of Rockville, right? I mean, Israelis who live in this country are not they're Jews and they live in America and they may even be American citizens, but they're not American Jews, right? They are a distinct subgroup within the Jewish people, right? And to deny that, I think, verges on anti-Semitism, or the proposed solutions can verge on anti-Semitism. So I agree with you. I mean, it is, yeah, I agree with you. So thank you for that. Anyone else?
If I also might interject.
Please.
It's Barnaby.
Yeah.
Okay. I definitely know, where people are coming from when they say that, such and such people is a recent construct, because, the Taiwanese identity is not really any older than the Japanese occupation, which dates to 1896. We're not an ancient, at least definable by a nation state. And, like being Israeli, like being Palestinian, it feels like that identifying as Taiwanese or either of those groups is just inherently political. You're, arguably for a lot of states, like, the U.S., if you identify as, American, then you're already making a statement about certain politics, and not all people are going to agree. So I think that that certain identities just attract controversy, and I don't think that's going to disappear anytime soon.
No, I think you're right, and to a certain extent, some of those identities are defined over and against something else. I mean, I think, like you said, I mean, the Taiwanese identity was formed in the Japanese occupation, right? And now it's over and against the mainland Chinese, the PRC, and I mean, I'm sure that before 1947 there was no Pakistani identity, right? I mean, they were Muslims who lived in the Indian subcontinent, right? And then there was certainly no Bangladeshi identity until the 60s, right? I mean, there was East Pakistan and West Pakistan. So, many nation states are new creations, right? But nobody goes around saying, well, Pakistan shouldn't exist. I mean, there are certainly people in the PRC who say Taiwan shouldn't exist. But that's a political, that's a political statement, and I think that, if you look at, for example, the former Yugoslavia or the former Czechoslovakia, right? The Czechs and the Slovaks can't live in one country, right? But the Palestinians and the Israelis should live in one country, and it should be a democracy. And I mean, and again, I have no problem with that as a goal. I have no problem with that as a goal. But to imagine that that's going to happen, overnight somehow or by fiat is just, to me, incredibly naive.
Absolutely.
And to try to impose it by fiat would just, be deadly, I think. To whom I'm not sure, whether it be deadly to Israelis or to Palestinians, but it would be deadly in one way or another, I think. I really do. All right. Anybody else?
Do you happen to know who the protesters were in this Philadelphia food truck situation?
I don't.
That's not exactly so that sounds like sort of a irrelevant point, but it sort of gets back to who are the ones who are anti-Semitic?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I've read a number of different articles on this question in both the Jewish press and the general press, and it doesn't refer to anything other than sort of rumors, right? So I don't know whether the rumored protesters were Palestinians or whether they were non-Jewish, non-Palestinian leftists. I don't know. I don't even know if the threats or protests were real. I mean, like I said, there's just, all you have to do is go to Google News and type in Moshe Philly, and you'll get, a lot of articles about it, but a lot of it is still really very unclear. Anyone else? Okay, going once, going twice. All right.
Rabbi Arian,
yes,
Stryker, thank you as always for your wonderful comments. I think one of the main issues in terms of dealing with these disparities is that with the new government coalition in Israel, I am very hopeful that unlike Netanyahu, they will really make a much stronger effort to again accept and want very much to have American influence, American activity, and most of all, to serve whatever American situations that they can to strengthen our feeling of this is great that Israel really understands a particular American issue and is willing to work with it, such as, the integrated prayer section near the main Western Wall. So my sense is that if that could happen, it would certainly help us here to feel a little more secure that Israel is trying to move forward in a positive manner.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Lapid said, a few days ago that he had promised that Israel would not surprise the United States. And then Netanyahu attacked him for that as giving up Israeli sovereignty. He didn't say that Israel wouldn't do what it needed to do, but that it wouldn't be a surprise. But I remember when and I'll wrap up with this because I think it's relevant and I think it gets to your point. When the Oslo agreements were signed back in like '93, I think it was, and that was a surprise. I mean, the United States was kept out of those negotiations until they were basically done. And if you remember those days, I mean, it was bizarre because saying that Israel should negotiate with the PLO and saying that Israel should recognize the Palestinian people and agree to a two-state solution was heresy. I mean, look, I was viciously attacked for saying things like that. And all of a sudden that went from heresy to orthodoxy. And so the Board of Rabbis had a meeting and Dennis Ross came to speak to the Board of Rabbis. And Dennis Ross was the guy who was really in charge of the Arab-Israeli stuff at the State Department at the time. He had that job under George H.W. Bush, and then he continued in that position under Clinton. And somebody asked him, I mean, what was it that motivated Rabin, who was a hardliner? He was a hardliner, to enter into this agreement. And Dennis Ross said that at least part of it is American support for Israel, and that American support for Israel is based, at least to some extent, in the American perception that the Israelis are just like us, right? We're a democracy, they're a democracy. We're pluralistic, they're pluralistic. We speak English, a lot of Israelis speak English. I mean, we'll certainly give that to Netanyahu, right? And we like basketball, they like basketball, right? And the persistence of the occupation was undermining that sense that Americans would have that Israel is just like us. Okay, now, I don't know how true that is, right? And to a certain extent, look, the world is very, very different in 2021 than it was in 1993, right? And I think, and certainly, I mean, and this is one of the things that I think Netanyahu did really wrong, is saying, and he said it pretty explicitly, okay, I don't care what the American Jewish community thinks, because I have the evangelicals, and the evangelicals are a far more powerful force in American politics than the Jews. He may be right if all you're cared about is the interests of the state of Israel, or more specifically of Benjamin Netanyahu, right? But the idea that Israel doesn't care what American Jews think because we have the evangelicals is not really designed to create warm feelings of fraternity and brotherhood between Israeli Jews and American Jews. And this is a problem. This is definitely a problem. You know, and that's where you know, I mean, I think Bennett, you know, it's interesting because I mean, Netanyahu was born in Israel, right? But his father was a professor first at what was then Dropsy College, now is part of Penn, the Institute for Jewish Studies at Penn, and then he was a professor at Cornell. So Netanyahu went to Akiba Hebrew Academy in Philadelphia, and he went to, I'm not sure where he got his undergraduate degree, but he has a Harvard MBA, right? And there were rumors that when Netanyahu and Bennett were meeting, where Netanyahu was trying to convince Bennett to go with him rather than with Lapid, that when they met, they spoke English to each other, because Bennett's parents are immigrants from San Francisco. Right, Bennett's parents are Olim from San Francisco, and Bennett also, because his father was involved in fundraising, so he spent some time growing up in the States and in Canada, and then after he finished his army service and he came back to the States and he started a high-tech cybersecurity company, and he lived in Manhattan. And he went to Kehillat Jeshurun in New York. So, you know, he understands the American Jewish community. And this is why, even though he's Orthodox, he is pushing, you know, some sort of arrangement for the egalitarian section of the Kotel, because he understands the importance of issues like this to diaspora Jewry. You know, and I think I don't know that there will be progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front. I mean, I think there will be at least a cessation of provocations by Israel. Now, will there be a cessation of provocations by the Palestinians? I'm less confident. But I think that there will be a cessation of provocations by Israel, and at least Israel will not do things to make the situation worse. But whether with such a diverse coalition they can actually do anything to make the situation better, but you know what? At least not making it worse is something. It's not nothing. So anyway, thank you for your comments, Steve, and good night, everybody. And if you are planning to come to services in person on Shabbat and you have not signed up, please do so. Okay. Joe Kampf and his daughter and son-in-law are planning to come, and it would be nice if we had a minion so that there's no issue of Kaddish. So thank you.